Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. Theresa May says the UK won't be half in, half out of the EU as she sets out her Brexit negotiating priorities. The Prime Minister is due to flesh out her Brexit plan in a speech to diplomats in central London. We'll bring you the speech live and uninterrupted here on BBC Two. After months of deliberation, the Prime Minister is expected to say the UK will leave the EU single market in order to take back control of immigration and British laws. But how much freedom will we have to strike our own free trade deals with countries like China, India and the United States? We'll have detailed analysis and political reaction. For 6 months since the referendum, Theresa May has stuck to her phrase that Brexit means Brexit. Well, today we find out what that really means. Well, we hope so, at least. In around 15 minutes, the Prime Minister will make a speech to an audience of diplomats in Lancaster House, central London, which Number 10 says will set out 12 priorities for the forthcoming Brexit negotiations. We're expecting the speech to last around 45 minutes, and we'll bring you all of it, live and uninterrupted. With me for our specially extended programme today are the Conservative Leave campaigner and former Cabinet Minister Theresa Villiers and Labour's Shadow International Trade Secretary Barry Gardiner. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
First of all, let's get the latest from our Assistant Political Editor, Norman Smith, who's outside Lancaster House. Norman, what can we expect?
Well, if you're expecting a sort of blueprint for Brexit, a feast of details, you are going to be disappointed. That is not what you are going to get. Yes, there will be confirmation we are leaving the single market, but beyond that, I suspect there will be remarkably little clarity. And the reason for that is so many of the key areas are absolutely central to Mrs May's negotiations, and she does not want in any way to compromise her approach. More than that, there is an ongoing disagreement, debate, call it what you will, within government over key aspects of Brexit. And on top of that, I think instinctively Theresa May rarely says more than she has to. So I suspect by the end of the day, we are not going to be massively wiser about the specific objectives that Theresa May is seeking. So, for example, on this issue of the customs union, it's clear Mrs May wants Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade deals outside the customs union. Equally, it's clear within government there is a view that there are huge advantages to British industry to remaining a part of the customs union. So that will form a critical part of the negotiations. We want to be out, but we want the benefits of staying in. So we're looking for some sort of deal. Likewise, on immigration, we could push for a really tough deal. We could insist on quotas for people who want to come from the EU to Britain, or we could go for a freedom of movement light, saying EU people can come here provided they've got a job. That, again, could form part of the negotiations. And lastly, Joe, on a transitional deal, we don't want to say, oh, we're desperate for a transitional deal because that makes Britain look weak, it makes us look on bended knee. That, too, is central to the negotiations. So because Mrs May has still got to go into the negotiating chamber, she absolutely does not want to put up in sort of neon advertising signs, this is what I want. So do not expect detail about her specific objectives.
She has talked about these 12 negotiating priorities, and taking what you've just said on board, we won't expect too much detail around some of the key issues. What's going to be in those negotiating priorities? Are they going to be pretty nebulous?
Well, I think what you will hear is a restatement of what Mrs May has already said many, many times before about taking back control of migration, taking back control of legal authority from the Supreme Court, taking back control of our money. Those are sort of the big overarching principles. What is going to be in her speech, primarily, I think, is going to be a message of reassurance. In a funny sort of way, today's speech has been cast as, you know, Theresa May setting out her plans. In many ways, I think she sees it as Theresa May talking to the world beyond Westminster. So, reassurance to voters, we're not going to be doing a hokey-cokey halfway in, halfway out. We're leaving. Brexit is going to happen. Reassurance to other EU countries, we're still going to remain friends, we still want to be colleagues, we still want to trade with you, and reassurance to the rest of the world, look, we're not going to become some sad, lonely island, not talking to the rest of the world, turning in on ourselves. It's that sort of bigger picture message rather than a nitty-gritty series of specific proposals that she wants to achieve.
Norman Smith, thank you. We'll let you go inside Lancaster House so you can listen to that speech. Theresa Villiers, is that what you're expecting? A clear, evidential sign that we are leaving the single market?
That's what's been briefed. I think that is highly likely to be in the speech, but I think Norman Smith is also right. At this stage, it doesn't make sense to have a very detailed negotiating blueprint in the public domain. So whilst we'll get an indication on the fact that we're leaving the internal market, I'm not sure we will get huge amounts of detail on other issues.
Do you accept that, Barry Gardiner?
Well, I think that the more the speech has been trailed in advance, it's probably the case that the less it will contain on the day. And I think it has been a speech where the Prime Minister is trying to say, look, this is on track. But actually, as Norman set out in his piece, and I think as Theresa would agree, the Prime Minister is in a difficult position trying to both appeal to that wider audience, but also trying to get the facts right. And that's about, are we going to have the benefit of the customs union? And she realises that that is in our economic interest, but of course she wants to make that bold statement that this is it, it's a clean cut, it's a clean break. That's a very difficult balance for her to get.
So as you've both said, leaving the single market, as has been briefed, is what she will outline today. To some extent, she's been pretty clear about that over the last few months anyway, so we're not going to hear anything different, if you like, on that. Do you agree then, as you have implied, that the detail and the argument about today will be about the customs union, about whether we are part of that customs union, which would make it difficult for us to then have free trade deals, which of course is the department that you are shadowing?
I think if you look at what the Conservative Party manifesto said, it talked about safeguarding Britain's interests in the single market, and it talked about completing the single market in terms of the digital economy. Now, it's clear that we have a Prime Minister who has now broken with those central pledges that were there in the Conservative manifesto, but she's done that without her own mandate. I think that puts her in a very difficult position, not only with the electorate, but with her own party. And she really does have to explain how, having come into being Prime Minister without any election, she is now revoking that clear commitment that was there in the Conservative manifesto to complete the single market. It's absolutely one thing to say we're leaving the EU, but then to say we're going to reject all the things that are in the economic benefit that create jobs and economic prosperity in this country. She has to explain that to the British public.
Right, well, let Theresa Villiers answer that then.
Better that we leave, we would be better off. She now has to explain how we're going to be better off.
Barry, the Conservative manifesto also said that we would hold a referendum and we would respect the result.
And we respect the result too. So now that she's in that position...
But to respect the result, we need to leave the internal market. That's a very extensive rule system, and it would leave us subject to the jurisdiction of European law and the European Court of Justice.
But you accept
both of those are inconsistent with respecting the leave vote. If we're really going to leave the European Union, we have to leave the internal market.
So what you're saying, Theresa, is that the Conservative manifesto contained inconsistent promises. What I'm asking is that now the Prime Minister should try and reconcile those by explaining to the British public why, on the one hand, she promised to make Britain better off by completing the internal market, by going for the digital economy, by safeguarding Britain's interests there, but now she says that she's going to make Britain better off by doing the opposite.
Right, well, let's talk about the phrase half in, half out. She doesn't want that. We're leaving the EU, she has said. Would you see partial membership of the customs union if we were in it for certain sectors? Would that still be half in for you?
My anxiety would be that If we stay partly in the customs union, again, we'd be likely to be subject to extensive rules and regulation and possibly the ECJ. But if we can find a way to avoid that, then it's not unreasonable for the Prime Minister to keep the option open. I think really, to be properly consistent with the Leave vote, we do need to leave the customs union as well as the internal market really
in its entirety.
Yes.
Right. So you don't want to be involved in any sectors at all as far as the customs union is concerned.
Well, the trouble is mixing and matching different sectors is quite difficult to reconcile with WTO rules.
Right. And do you agree, Barry Gardner, that then the UK would still be half in, if you like, if we remained even partially as part of the customs union?
No, not at all, because what you have is, for example, you have both Norway and Switzerland on the other hand, one of them inside the single market but not part of the EU, the other inside the customs union but not part of the EU. So the EFTA and the EEA models are separate, where those countries are not they're not members of the European Union. So strictly speaking, that's not correct. But the point that Theresa May made about the World Trade Organization is an important one, because actually what the WTO says is that in order to be part of a customs union, you have to be substantially within it, and that means it's about 85% to 90% of all of your exports have to be part of the WTO.
Right, and we've just seen Theresa May going inside Lancaster House. She is due to speak in the next 4 minutes or so for a speech that's supposed to last about 45 minutes. So she's gone inside Lancaster House. We can expect that speech fairly shortly. Now, let's take a quick look at the timetable to Brexit. Theresa May's speech comes ahead of a decision by the Supreme Court on whether she will need the approval of Parliament to trigger Article 50. That ruling is expected by the end of January. The government has already committed to publish a plan for leaving the EU before Article 50 is invoked. The Brexit Select Committee has called for a white paper to be published by mid-February. The Prime Minister has said Article 50 will be triggered by the end of March, firing the starting gun on up to 2 years of exit talks. But the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, has said the negotiations could only last for 18 months in order to give EU institutions time to ratify the deal. Further talks may need to take place after that to agree Britain's post-Brexit trading relationship with the EU if this cannot be negotiated in parallel with the exit deal. And throughout the speech, the BBC's reality check team will be fact-checking Theresa May's claims and posting comments on the BBC Politics live page and tweeting. I'm sure they'll be extremely busy. In terms of the timetable, Labour is not going to block the triggering of Article 50. Is that correct?
That's absolutely right. Look, we have accepted that the will of the public was clear. It was a huge vote. 52% were in favour of leaving, 48% against, but that's a clear majority and we accept that. So we will not block it. What we will try and do is set out the way in which we think it should be delivered, because there was no clarity about how we should leave, and that's what we need. And it's also what the Prime Minister promised before Christmas, what in fact Parliament voted on before Christmas. And the government accepted that they would set out a paper to Parliament setting out the negotiating terms and conditions. Now, today's speech is not a government paper, and as Norman Smith said in his introduction.
So will it be enough for you if she does flesh out the broad principles?
No, not at all. We want a paper from the government to Parliament, not simply a speech.
And Theresa Villiers, what would be
world.
wrong with that? Why shouldn't government actually flesh out much more clearly beyond what this speech is expected to set out to MPs across the House, bearing in mind the opposition has said they won't block triggering Article 50?
Well, it may well be that the government does publish further documents before a vote is taken in Parliament, but actually ministers are engaging every single day in Parliament on how we'll approach these negotiations. This speech will be another significant landmark setting out what our objectives are. You know, every step of the way Parliament is involved. What wouldn't be wise is to set out all the detail of our negotiating strategy.
If the government fails to provide some sort of paper setting out the negotiating position, what will you do?
Well, they will have broken their promise to
Sure,
Parliament.
but what
They
will you
have
do?
What we will do is we will table a reasoned amendment setting out what we believe should be the case. Ultimately, if the government defeats that, as of course they have the majority in Parliament to do, and it's their privilege, their right to do that as the government, then they will be able to trigger Article 50 without having provided the detail to Parliament for proper parliamentary scrutiny. But I would say that today, it's not acceptable for the Prime Minister to be making the fundamental points about how she's approaching and how the country is approaching these negotiations, not to Parliament.
All right.
Parliamentary scrutiny is important. That is indeed what the Brexiteers said they were bringing back sovereignty to the UK to enforce.
Let's just go inside the room at Lancaster House. We can see there diplomats from EU states gathered inside with members of the press too, waiting for this speech from Theresa May, which is due to start in the next few minutes or so. Lots of anticipation, no doubt. There's our very own political editor, Laura Kunsberg, there on the front row. Theresa Villiers, you were going to interject when Barry Gardiner was speaking.
Well, I think it's crucial to point out that actually Parliament is engaged every day in this process. I mean, barely a day goes by when we don't have a debate on this, and very often Labour don't even have the speakers to
But
take
what will
part.
they be able to debate on if they don't have the information within their grasp?
The Prime Minister set out, the fundamentals of her objectives in her Conservative Party conference speech. We're going to get more detail today. What we don't want is wrecking amendments in the legislation's table.
Barry Gardiner said that that's not going to happen. They're not going to be wrecking amendments. Is that right?
Absolutely. Look, we want, if we are leaving, as we now accept that we are, we want to make a success of it. But a success of it means jobs in this country, it means economic growth.
And remaining within the customs
being
union.
poor.
And does that mean remaining within the customs union?
We think that actually we should be getting the best possible access in either in the customs union and the single market that we possibly can for our goods and services on a tariff-free and also on a non-tariff-free basis. Those barriers must remain down.
Although that would mean, according to the European Union, certainly on a tariff-free basis in terms of access to the single market, that we would then have to sign up to the rules of freedom of movement.
Well, that's subject to negotiation. Of course, it's very
Any indication you've had that they would give way on that?
Absolutely none. It's very clear from the other side of the negotiating table that they hold the four freedoms to be absolutely essential.
Right.
But there has been a concession that was given indeed to David Cameron on timescales and the 4-year concession that they talked about. There may be a way of pushing that further. That is subject to negotiation.
All right.
Both sides were very clear that leaving the EU meant leaving the internal market. During the referendum, that was very, very clear from both sides.
Right. In terms of the negotiations, what are your views on the transitional arrangement? Because there are hints, even if Theresa May doesn't actually cover it today, that there should be a transitional arrangement with the EU if negotiations aren't completed by 2019. Would you support that?
It depends what sort of transitional arrangement we're talking about. If it's something that effectively sort of keeps us in the EEA or EFTA for years on end, then I don't think that would be acceptable. If it's relatively short or sector-specific, it could make sense, but you can't answer the single question about whether transitional arrangements are acceptable or not. It depends entirely on what type of transitional arrangements.
Would you
they are.
prefer, to use the clean and hard Brexit terms, for the UK to just come out come what may in 2019, whether or not they have completed a deal with the EU that is satisfactory for the government?
I'd prefer that we limited the period of uncertainty, so we had a clean break from the EU at the end of the Article 50 process. Inevitably, there will be some types of transitional arrangements to help industry deal with that transition. But I think the more we can do to get this decision made as quickly as possible, the better for our economy, and also it gives us the opportunity to start negotiating with other countries on trade deals.
Do you accept, Barry Gardiner, if we stay part of the customs union within that group of countries that trades within the customs union? Oh, I'm going to stop there. We'll answer that afterwards, because here is the Prime Minister, Theresa May, taking her place there on the podium to deliver her speech on Brexit.
A little over 6 months ago, the British people voted for change. They voted to shape a brighter future for our country. They voted to leave the European Union and embrace the world. And they did so with their eyes open. accepting that the road ahead will be uncertain at times, but believing that it leads towards a brighter future for their children and their grandchildren too. And it is the job of this government to deliver it. That means more than negotiating our new relationship with the EU. It means taking the opportunity of this great moment of national change to step back and ask ourselves what kind of country we want to be. My answer is clear. I want this United Kingdom to emerge from this period of change stronger, fairer, more united, and more outward-looking than ever before. I want us to be a secure, prosperous, tolerant country, a magnet for international talent, and a home to the pioneers and innovators who will shape the world ahead. I want us to be a truly global Britain, the best friend and neighbour to our European partners, but a country that reaches beyond the borders of Europe too. A country that goes out into the world to build relationships with old friends and new allies alike. I want Britain to be what we have the potential, talent, and ambition to be, a great global trading nation that is respected around the world and strong, confident, and united at home. That is why this government has a plan for Britain. One that gets us the right deal abroad, but also ensures we get a better deal for ordinary working people at home. It's why that plan sets out how we will use this moment of change to build a stronger economy and a fairer society by embracing genuine economic and social reform. Why our new modern industrial strategy is being developed to ensure every nation and area of the United Kingdom can make the most of the opportunities ahead. Why we will go further to reform our schools to ensure every child has the knowledge and the skills they need to thrive in post-Brexit Britain. Why, as we continue to bring the deficit down, we will take a balanced approach by investing in our economic infrastructure, because it can transform the growth potential of our economy and improve the quality of people's lives across the whole country. It's why we will put the preservation of our precious union at the heart of everything we do, because it is only by coming together as one great union of nations and people that we can make the most of the opportunities ahead. The result of the referendum was not a decision to turn inward and retreat from the world, because Britain's history and culture is profoundly internationalist. We are a European country and proud of our shared European heritage, but we are also a country that has always looked beyond Europe to the wider world. That is why we are one of the most racially diverse countries in Europe, one of the most multicultural members of the European Union, and why, whether we're talking about India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, America, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, countries in Africa, or those that are closer to home in Europe, so many of us have close friends and relatives from across the world. Instinctively, we want to travel to, study in, trade with countries not just in Europe, but beyond the borders of our continent. Even now, as we prepare to leave the EU, we are planning for the next biennial Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in 2018, a reminder of our unique and proud global relationships. And it is important to recognise this fact. June the 23rd was not the moment Britain chose to step back from the world. It was the moment we chose to build a truly global Britain. I know that this and the other reasons Britain took such a decision is not always well understood among our friends and allies in Europe. And I know many fear that this might herald the beginning of a greater unravelling of the EU. But let me be clear, I do not want that to happen. It would not be in the best interests of Britain. It remains overwhelmingly and compellingly in Britain's national interest that the EU should succeed. And that is why I hope, in the months and years ahead, we will all reflect on the lessons of Britain's decision to leave. So let me take this opportunity to set out the reasons for our decision and to address the people of Europe directly. It's not simply because our history and culture is profoundly internationalist, important though that is. Many in Britain have always felt that the United Kingdom's place in the European Union came at the expense of our global ties and of a bolder embrace of free trade with the wider world. There are other important reasons too. Our political traditions are different. Unlike other European countries, we have no written constitution, but the principle of parliamentary sovereignty is the basis of our unwritten constitutional settlement. We have only a recent history of devolved governance, though it has rapidly embedded itself. And we have little history of coalition government. The public expect to be able to hold their governments to account very directly. And as a result, supranational institutions, as strong as those created by the European Union, sit very uneasily in relation to our political history and way of life. And while I know Britain might at times have been seen as an awkward member state, the European Union has struggled to deal with the diversity of its member countries and their interests. It bends towards uniformity, not flexibility. David Cameron's negotiation was a valiant final attempt to make it work for Britain. And I want to thank all those elsewhere in Europe who helped him to reach an agreement. But the blunt truth, as we know, is that there was not enough flexibility on many important matters for a majority of British voters. Now, I do not believe that these things apply uniquely to Britain. Britain is not the only member state where there is a strong attachment to accountable and democratic government, such a strong internationalist mindset, or a belief that diversity within Europe should be celebrated. And so I believe there is a lesson in Brexit, not just for Britain, but if it wants to succeed, for the EU itself. Because our continent's great strength has always been its diversity. And there are two ways of dealing with different interests. You can respond by trying to hold things together by force, tightening a vice-like grip that ends up crushing into tiny pieces the very things you want to protect. Or you can respect difference, cherish it even, and reform the EU so that it deals better with the wonderful diversity of its member states. So to our friends across Europe, let me say this. Our vote to leave the European Union was no rejection of the values we share. The decision to leave the EU represents no desire to become more distant to you, our friends and neighbours. It was no attempt to do harm to the EU itself or to any of its remaining member states. We do not want to turn the clock back to the days when Europe was less peaceful, less secure, and less able to trade freely. It was a vote to restore, as we see it, our parliamentary democracy, national self-determination, and to become even more global and internationalist in action and in spirit. We will continue to be reliable partners, willing allies and close friends. We want to buy your goods and services, sell you ours, trade with you as freely as possible, and work with one another to make sure we are all safer, more secure, and more prosperous through continued friendship. You will still be welcome in this country, as we hope our citizens will be welcome in yours. At a time when together we face a serious threat from our enemies, Britain's unique intelligence capabilities will continue to help to keep people in Europe safe from terrorism. And at a time when there is growing concern about European security, Britain's servicemen and women based in European countries, including Estonia, Poland, and Romania, will continue to do their duty. We are leaving the European Union, but we are not leaving Europe. And that is why we seek a new and equal partnership between an independent, self-governing global Britain and our friends and allies in the EU. Not partial membership of the European Union, associate membership of the European Union, or anything that leaves us half in, half out. We do not seek to adopt a model already enjoyed by other countries. We do not seek to hold on to bits of membership as we leave. No, the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, And my job is to get the right deal for Britain as we do. So today, I want to outline our objectives for the negotiation ahead. 12 objectives that amount to one big goal: a new, positive and constructive partnership between Britain and the European Union. And as we negotiate that partnership, we will be driven by some simple principles. We will provide as much certainty and clarity as we can at every stage, and we will take this opportunity to make Britain stronger, to make Britain fairer, and to build a more global Britain too. The first objective is crucial. We will provide certainty whenever we can. We are about to enter a negotiation. That means there will be give and take. There will have to be compromises. It will require imagination on both sides. And not everybody will be able to know everything at every stage. But I recognise how important it is to provide business, the public sector, and everybody with as much certainty as possible as we move through the process. So where we can offer that certainty, we will do so. That is why last year we acted quickly to give clarity about farm payments and university funding. And it is why, as we repeal the European Communities Act, we will convert the acquis, the body of existing EU law, into British law. This will give the country maximum certainty as we leave the EU. The same rules and laws will apply on the day after Brexit as they did before. And it will be for the British Parliament to decide on any changes to that law after full scrutiny and proper parliamentary debate. And when it comes to Parliament, there is one other way in which I would like to provide certainty. I can confirm today that the government will put the final deal that is agreed between the UK and the EU to a vote in both Houses of Parliament before it comes into force. Our second guiding principle is to build a stronger Britain. That means taking control of our own affairs, as those who voted in their millions to leave the European Union demanded we must. So we will take back control of our laws and bring an end to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice in Britain. Leaving the European Union will mean that our laws will be made in Westminster, Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast. And those laws will be interpreted by judges not in Luxembourg, but in courts across this country. Because we will not have truly left the European Union if we are not in control of our own laws. A stronger Britain demands that we do something else. Strengthen the precious union between the four nations of the United Kingdom. At this momentous time, it is more important than ever that we face the future together, united by what makes us strong, the bonds that unite us as a people, and our shared interest in the UK being an open, successful trading nation in the future. And I hope that same spirit of unity will imply in Northern Ireland in particular over the coming months in the Assembly elections. And the main parties there will work together to re-establish a partnership government as soon as possible. Foreign affairs are, of course, the responsibility of the UK government, and in dealing with them, we act in the interests of all parts of the United Kingdom. As Prime Minister, I take that responsibility seriously. I've also been determined from the start that the devolved administration should be fully engaged in this process. That's why the government has set up a joint ministerial committee on EU negotiations. So ministers from each of the UK's devolved administrations can contribute to the process of planning for our departure from the European Union. We've already received a paper from the Scottish Government and look forward to receiving a paper from the Welsh Government shortly. Both papers will be considered as part of this important process. We won't agree on everything, but I look forward to working with the administrations in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland to deliver a Brexit that works for the whole of the United Kingdom. Part of that will mean working very carefully to ensure that as powers are repatriated from Brussels back to Britain, the right powers are returned to Westminster and the right powers are passed to the devolved administrations of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. As we do so, our guiding principle must be to ensure that as we leave the European Union, no new barriers to living and doing business within our own union are created. That means maintaining the necessary common standards and frameworks for our own domestic market, empowering the UK as an open trading nation to strike the best trade deals around the world, and protecting the common resources of our islands. And as we do this, I should equally be clear that no decisions currently taken by the devolved administrations will be removed from them. We cannot forget that as we leave, the United Kingdom will share a land border with the EU, and maintaining that common travel area with the Republic of Ireland will be an important priority for the UK in the talks ahead. There has been a common travel area between the UK and the Republic of Ireland for many years. Indeed, it was formed before either of our two countries were members of the European Union. And the family ties and bonds of affection that unite our two countries mean that there will always be a special relationship between us. So we will work to deliver a practical solution that allows the maintenance of the common travel area with the Republic, while protecting the integrity of the United Kingdom's immigration system. Nobody wants to return to the borders of the past, so we will make it a priority to deliver a practical solution as soon as we can. The third principle is to build a fairer Britain. That means ensuring it is fair to everyone who lives and works in this country. And that is why we will ensure we can control immigration to Britain from Europe. We will continue to attract the brightest and the best to work or study in Britain. Indeed, openness to international talent must remain one of this country's most distinctive assets. But that process must be managed properly so that our immigration system serves the national interest. So we will get control of the number of people coming to Britain from the EU. Because while controlled immigration can bring great benefits, filling skill shortages, delivering public services, making British businesses the world beaters they often are, when the numbers get too high, public support for the system falters. In the last decade or so, we've seen record levels of net migration in Britain, and that sheer volume has put pressure on public services like schools, stretched our infrastructure, especially housing, and put a downward pressure on wages for working class people. As Home Secretary for 6 years, I know that you cannot control immigration overall when there is free movement to Britain from Europe. Britain is an open and tolerant country. We will always want immigration, especially high-skilled immigration. We will always want immigration from Europe, and we will always welcome individual migrants as friends. But the message from the public before and during the referendum campaign was clear. Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come to Britain from Europe, and that is what we will deliver. Fairness demands that we deal with another issue as soon as possible, too. We want to guarantee the rights of EU citizens who are already living in Britain and the rights of British nationals in other member states as early as we can. I've told other EU leaders that we could give people the certainty they want straight away and reach such a deal now. Many of them favour such an agreement. One or two others do not. But I want everyone to know that it remains an important priority for Britain and for many other member states to resolve this challenge as soon as possible, because it is the right and fair thing to do. And a fairer Britain is a country that protects and enhances the rights people have at work. That is why, as we translate the body of European law into our domestic regulations, we will ensure that workers' rights are fully protected and maintained. Indeed, under my leadership, not only will the government protect the rights of workers set out in European legislation, we will build on them. Because under this Conservative government, we will make sure legal protection for workers keeps pace with the changing labour market, and that the voices of workers are heard by the boards of publicly listed companies for the first time. But the great prize for this country, the opportunity ahead, is to use this moment to build a truly global Britain. a country that reaches out to old friends and new allies alike, a great global trading nation, and one of the firmest advocates for free trade anywhere in the world. That starts with our close friends and neighbours in Europe. So as a priority, we will pursue a bold and ambitious free trade agreement with the European Union. This agreement should allow for the freest possible trade in goods and services between Britain and the EU's member states. It should give British companies the maximum freedom to trade with and operate within European markets, and let European businesses do the same in Britain. But I want to be clear. What I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market. European leaders have said many times that membership means accepting the four freedoms of goods, capital, services, and people. And being out of the EU, but a member of the single market, would mean complying with the EU's rules and regulations that implement those freedoms without having a vote on what those rules and regulations are. It would mean accepting a role for the European Court of Justice that would see it still having direct legal authority in our country. It would, to all intents and purposes, mean not leaving the EU at all. And that is why both sides in the referendum campaign made it clear that a vote to leave the EU would be a vote to leave the single market. So we do not seek membership of the single market. Instead, we seek the greatest possible access to it through a new, comprehensive, bold, and ambitious free trade agreement. That agreement may take in elements of current single market arrangements in certain areas, on the export of cars and lorries, for example, or the freedom to provide financial services across national borders, as it makes no sense to start again from scratch when Britain and the remaining member states have adhered to the same rules for so many years. But I respect the position taken by European leaders who have been clear about their position, just as I am clear about mine. So an important part of the new strategic partnership we seek with the EU will be the pursuit of the greatest possible access to the single market on a fully reciprocal basis through a comprehensive free trade agreement. And because we will no longer be members of the single market, we will not be required to contribute huge sums to the EU budget. There may be some specific European programmes in which we might want to participate. If so, and this will be for us to decide, it's reasonable that we should make an appropriate contribution. But the principle is clear. The days of Britain making vast contributions to the European Union every year will end. But it is not just trade with the EU we should be interested in. A global Britain must be free to strike trade agreements with countries from outside the European Union too. Because important though our trade with the EU is and will remain, it is clear that the UK needs to increase significantly its trade with the fastest growing export markets in the world. Since joining the EU, trade as a percentage of GDP has broadly stagnated in the UK. That is why it is time for Britain to get out into the world and rediscover its role as a great global trading nation. This is such a priority for me that when I became Prime Minister, I established for the first time a Department for International Trade led by Liam Fox. We want to get out into the wider world, to trade and do business all around the globe. Countries including China, Brazil, and the Gulf states have already expressed their interest in striking trade deals with us. We've started discussions on future trade ties with countries like Australia, New Zealand, and India. And President-elect Trump has said Britain is not at the back of the queue for a trade deal with the United States, the world's biggest economy, but front of the line. I know my emphasis on striking trade agreements with countries outside Europe has led to questions about whether Britain seeks to remain a member of the EU's customs union. And it is true that full customs union membership prevents us from negotiating our own comprehensive trade deals. Now, I want Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade agreements, but I also want tariff-free trade with Europe and cross-border trade there to be as frictionless as possible. That means I do not want Britain to be part of the common commercial policy, and I do not want us to be bound by the common external tariff. These are the elements of the customs union that prevent us from striking our own comprehensive trade agreements with other countries. But I do want us to have a customs agreement with the EU. Whether that means we must reach a completely new customs agreement, become an associate member of the customs union in some way, or remain a signatory to some elements of it, I hold no preconceived position. I have an open mind on how we do it. It is not the means that matter, but the ends. And those ends are clear. I want to remove as many barriers to trade as possible. And I want Britain to be free to establish our own tariff schedules at the World Trade Organization, meaning we can reach new trade agreements, not just with the EU, but with old friends and new allies from outside Europe too. A global Britain must also be a country that looks to the future. That means being one of the best places in the world for science and innovation. One of our great strengths as a nation is the breadth and depth of our academic and scientific communities, backed up by some of the world's best universities. And we have a proud history of leading and supporting cutting-edge research and innovation. So we will also welcome agreement to continue to collaborate with our European partners on major science, research, and technology initiatives. From space exploration to clean energy to medical technologies, Britain will remain at the forefront of collective endeavours to better understand and make better the world in which we live. And a global Britain will continue to cooperate with its European partners in important areas such as crime, terrorism, and foreign affairs. All of us in Europe face the challenge of cross-border crime, a deadly terrorist threat, and the dangers presented by hostile states. All of us share interests and values in common, values we want to see projected around the world. With the threats to our common security becoming more serious, our response cannot be to cooperate with one another less, but to work together more. I therefore want our future relationship with the European Union to include practical arrangements on matters of law enforcement and the sharing of intelligence material with our EU allies. I'm proud of the role Britain has played and will continue to play in promoting Europe's security. Britain has led Europe on the measures needed to keep our continent secure, whether it's implementing sanctions against Russia following its action in Crimea, working for peace and stability in the Balkans, or securing Europe's external border. We will continue to work closely with our European allies in foreign and defence policy, even as we leave the EU itself. These are our objectives for the negotiation ahead, objectives that will help to realise our ambition of shaping that stronger, fairer global Britain that we want to see. They are the basis for a new, strong, constructive partnership with the European Union, a partnership of friends and allies, of interests and values, a partnership for a strong EU and a strong UK. But there is one further objective we are setting. For as I have said before, it is in no one's interests for there to be a cliff edge for business or a threat to stability as we change from our existing relationship to a new partnership with the EU. By this, I do not mean that we will seek some form of unlimited transitional status in which we find ourselves stuck forever in some kind of permanent political purgatory. That would not be good for Britain, but nor do I believe it would be good for the EU. Instead, I want us to have reached an agreement about our future partnership by the time the two-year Article 50 process has concluded. From that point onwards, we believed a phased process of implementation in which both Britain and the EU institutions and member states prepare for the new arrangements that will exist between us will be in our mutual self-interest. This will give businesses enough time to plan and prepare for those new arrangements. This might be about our immigration controls, customs systems, or the way in which we cooperate on criminal justice matters. Or it might be about the future legal and regulatory framework for financial services. For each issue, the time we need to phase in the new arrangements may differ. Some might be introduced very quickly, some might take longer. And the interim arrangements we rely on are likely to be a matter of negotiation. But the purpose is clear. We will seek to avoid a disruptive cliff edge, and we will do everything we can to phase in the new arrangements we require as Britain and the EU move towards our new partnership. So these are the objectives we have set. Certainty wherever possible, control of our own laws, strengthening the United Kingdom, maintaining the common travel area with Ireland, control of immigration, rights for EU nationals in Britain and British nationals in the EU, enhancing rights for workers, free trade with European markets, new trade agreements with other countries, a leading role in science and innovation, cooperation on crime, terrorism and foreign affairs, and a phased approach delivering a smooth and orderly Brexit. This is the framework of a deal that will herald a new partnership between the UK and the EU. It is a comprehensive and carefully considered plan that focuses on the ends, not just the means, with its eyes fixed firmly on the future and on the kind of country we will be once we leave. It reflects the hard work of many in this room today who have worked tirelessly to bring it together and to prepare this country for the negotiations ahead. And it will, I know, be debated and discussed at length. That is only right. But those who urge us to reveal more, such as the blow-by-blow details of our negotiating strategy, the areas in which we might compromise, the places where we think there are potential trade-offs, will not be acting in the national interest. Because this is not a game or a time for opposition's sake. It is a crucial and sensitive negotiation that will define the interests and the success of our country for many years to come. And it is vital that we maintain our discipline. That is why I've said before and will continue to say that every stray word and every hyped-up media report is going to make it harder for us to get the right deal for Britain. Our opposite numbers in the European Commission know it, which is why they are keeping their discipline. The ministers in government know it, which is why we will also maintain ours. So however frustrating some people find it, the government will not be pressured into saying more than I believe it is in our national interest to say. Because it's not my job to fill column inches with daily updates, but to get the right deal for Britain. And that is what I intend to do. I am confident that a deal and a new strategic partnership between the UK and the EU can be achieved. This is firstly because, having held conversations with almost every leader from every single EU member state, having spent time talking to the senior figures from the European institutions, including President Tusk, President Juncker and President Schulz, and after my cabinet colleagues, David Davis, Philip Hammond, Boris Johnson, have done the same with their interlocutors, I am confident that the vast majority want a positive relationship between the UK and the EU after Brexit. And I am confident that the objectives I am setting out today are consistent with the needs of the EU and its member states. That's why our objectives include a proposed free trade agreement between Britain and the European Union and explicitly rule out membership of the EU's single market. Because when the EU's leaders say they believe the four freedoms of the single market are indivisible, we respect that position. When the 27 member states say they want to continue their journey inside the European Union, we not only respect that fact, but support it. Because we do not want to undermine the single market, and we do not want to undermine the European Union. We want the EU to be a success, and we want its remaining member states to prosper. And of course, we want the same for Britain. And the second reason I believe it is possible to reach a good deal is that the kind of agreement I have described today is the economically rational thing that both Britain and the EU should aim for. Because trade is not a zero-sum game. More of it makes us all more prosperous. Free trade between Britain and the European Union means more trade means more jobs and more wealth creation. The erection of new barriers to trade, meanwhile, means the reverse. Less trade, fewer jobs, lower growth. The third and final reason I believe we can come to the right agreement is that cooperation between Britain and the EU is needed not just when it comes to trade, but when it comes to our security too. Britain and France are Europe's only two nuclear powers. We are the only two European countries with permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council. Britain's armed forces are a crucial part of Europe's collective defence. And our intelligence capabilities, unique in Europe, have already saved countless lives in very many terrorist plots that have been thwarted in countries across our continent. After Brexit, Britain wants to be a good friend and neighbour in every way, and that includes defending the safety and security of all of our citizens. So I believe the framework I have outlined today is in Britain's interests, it is in Europe's interests, and it is in the interests of the wider world. But I must be clear. Britain wants to remain a good friend and neighbour to Europe. Yet I know there are some voices calling for a punitive deal that punishes Britain and discourages other countries from taking the same path. That would be an act of calamitous self-harm for the countries of Europe, and it would not be the act of a friend. Britain would not, indeed we could not, accept such an approach. And while I am confident that this scenario need never arise, while I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Because we would still be able to trade with Europe, we would still be free to strike trade deals across the world, and we would have the freedom to set the competitive tax rates and embrace the policies that would attract the world's best companies and biggest investors to Britain. And if we were excluded from accessing the single market, we would be free to change the basis of Britain's economic model. But for the EU, it would mean new barriers to trade with one of the biggest economies in the world. It would jeopardise investments in Britain by EU companies worth more than £500 billion. It would mean a loss of access for European firms to the financial services of the City of London. It would risk exports from the EU to Britain worth around £290 billion every year. And it would disrupt the sophisticated and integrated supply chains upon which many EU companies rely. Important sectors of the EU economy would also suffer. We're a crucial, profitable export market for Europe's automotive industry, as well as sectors including energy, food and drink, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and agriculture. These sectors employ millions of people around Europe. And I don't believe that the EU's leaders will seriously tell German exporters, French farmers, Spanish fishermen, the young unemployed of the Eurozone, and millions of others that they want to make them poorer just to punish Britain and make a political point. For all these reasons, and because of our shared values and the spirit of goodwill that exists on both sides, I am confident that we will follow a better path. I am confident that a positive agreement can be reached. It's right that the government should prepare for every eventuality, but to do so in the knowledge that a constructive and optimistic approach to the negotiations to come is in the best interests of Europe and the best interests of Britain. We do not approach these negotiations expecting failure, but anticipating success, because we are a great global nation with so much to offer Europe and so much to offer the world. One of the world's largest and strongest economies, with the finest intelligence services, the bravest armed forces, the most effective hard and soft power, and friendships, partnerships, and alliances in every continent. And another thing that's important, the essential ingredient of our success, the strength and support of 65 million people willing us to make it happen. because after all the division and discord, the country is coming together. The referendum was divisive at times, and those divisions have taken time to heal. But one of the reasons that Britain's democracy has been such a success for so many years is that the strength of our identity as one nation, the respect we show to one another as fellow citizens, and the importance we attach to our institutions means that when a vote has been held, we all respect the result. The victors have the responsibility to act magnanimously. The losers have the responsibility to respect the legitimacy of the outcome, and the country comes together. And that is what we are seeing today. Business isn't calling to reverse the result, but planning to make a success of it. The House of Commons has voted overwhelmingly for us to get on with it. And the overwhelming majority of people, however they voted, want us to get on with it too. So that is what we will do. Not merely forming a new partnership with Europe, but building a stronger, fairer, more global Britain too. And let that be the legacy of our time, the prize towards which we work, the destination at which we arrive once the negotiation is done. And let us not do it for ourselves, but for those who follow, for the country's children and grandchildren too. So that when future generations look back at this time, they will judge us not only by the decision that we made, but by what we made of that decision. They will see that we shaped them a brighter future. They will know that we built them a better Britain. Thank you.
That was Theresa May there, speaking for nearly 45 minutes in the end, setting out her priorities in what was quite a frank and wide-ranging speech. She made clear what, to some extent, we've all known, which is that UK cannot remain a member of the single market because, she said, the UK would then have to accept the EU's 4 key freedoms. She went on to say, perhaps slightly unexpectedly, that there wouldn't be full membership of the customs union. People certainly thought she wouldn't be as clear as perhaps she was in the end, because that would, she said, prevent striking our own free trade deals. And that was very much the backdrop for this speech. The title behind her head there on the podium, A Global Britain. She talked an awful lot about free trade, about being an outward-looking country, but that would then preclude remaining a member of the customs union. But she did say full membership. And of course, there'll be a lot of detail about whether there will be a partial membership of the customs union for certain sectors, a little bit like Turkey, for example. Now, although she said that we wouldn't be members of the single market, which I think we all knew, she did say she wanted the greatest possible access. That was clear. And she said the days of making vast contributions to the EU coffers were over. That didn't rule out making some contributions, some financial contributions. And you may remember that David Davis didn't rule that out, particularly, again, if you wanted certain arrangements for certain sectors. She also went on to say we might want to stay part of some of the EU's programmes. Then she talked about transitional arrangements, that there would have to be some sort of transitional arrangement to avoid what she called a cliff edge in 2019, and we talked about that earlier. And she also said that this wasn't a time for the opposition to oppose what the government was proposing for opposition's sake. She also made a call to her own party and saying it was vital to maintain discipline. Crucially, though, she promised a parliamentary vote on the deal that her government actually comes back to Parliament with, and that would be at the end of the negotiations on the deal to leave the EU. With me, of course, are my two guests, the Conservative Leave campaigner Theresa Villiers, who is also a member of the Cabinet, and with me Barry Gardner, who shadows Liam Fox in international trade. First of all, your response to the speech, Theresa Villiers. Have you got pretty much what you wanted?
I think it's a great speech. I have to say that I feel quite emotional. The fact that this is yet another big step towards becoming an independent country again. The confirmation that we're leaving the internal market, the reiteration that we're going to take back control of making our own laws, interspersed with sort of sensible pragmatism about phased implementation and these kind of questions. I think it's a very welcome speech.
Except, of course, if the EU and other member states don't quite give Theresa May and her government what they want in terms of that crucial free trade deal with the rest of Europe.
Well, the Prime Minister has spoken quite tough terms about that, but it's so... I mean, it's very clear that it's in the interest of both sides to reach a sensible accommodation on trade. And as the Prime Minister pointed out, it really would be, Europe acting against its own interest to punish us. The effect of punishing us leaves them poorer, particularly our nearest neighbour in Ireland. So I think it was right to send that message. I hope that the EU does see sense on that. But even if they don't give us a trade deal, then we trade on most favoured nation status under the WTO rules. Other countries in the world do more business with Europe than we do on the basis of that WTO
Although
system.
she said she wouldn't like the UK to fall off a cliff edge economically, and then there would have to be some sort of transitional arrangement. Are you disappointed, Barry Gardiner? We're out of the single market, which is not what Labour wanted, even if you've accepted it, and we're out, certainly as full members of the customs union, presumably because otherwise we wouldn't be able to do the free trade deals that she wants us to do.
That certainly appears to be the case. Look, I want to start by welcoming one central aspect of the speech, and that is that she has committed to 2 votes in Parliament, one in the House of Commons and one in the House of Lords. I think that is a critical concession, and I'm delighted that she's made that, because it certainly was not on the cards a few months ago. I think when she talks about frictionless access into European markets, we have to look at what this new free trade agreement arrangement with the EU is that she's proposing. Because frictionless access means that you would have to have a harmonisation or a recognition of the equivalence of the standards and the regulations in each of the countries.
And that's possible.
It's possible, but what it does mean is that we are still accepting the regulations put in place by Brussels as being acceptable for the UK. And that does rather go against what she spoke of, and I noted it here, the parliamentary democracy and self-determination, which were the key messages that she wanted to get across.
Can I just put you on this issue of a vote at the end of the deal? We've had the 2-year negotiation. Let's assume for a moment that there is a deal to put to Parliament. Is there any scenario under which you could see Labour voting that down?
Look, we want to respect the will of the British people that we come out of the European Union. We need, and here the Prime Minister was right to say this is not a time for opposition's sake.
Right. So
it is a time for the opposition to do what I hope that Her Majesty's opposition always does, which is to oppose the government in the interests of the British people.
But if you thought it was a bad deal, would you vote it down?
Well, that's precisely the point. If we think it is the wrong deal, if we think it has gone about things to make Britain not richer, but poorer, if it's going to actually sacrifice people's jobs instead of create jobs, then of course it would be our obligation at that point, and by giving the vote, she automatically assumes that there's a possibility of the deal being voted down.
Right, and I'll come to you in just a moment, Theresa Villiers. Both of you obviously staying for this special programme throughout. I can just say that the Prime Minister, having finished her speech, is now answering questions from the press, and if there are any crucial answers she gives to those questions, we will of course play them to you on this programme. We can now talk to UKIP's Deputy Chair, Suzanne Evans. Were you pleased with that speech?
Yes, I was. I was chuckling at some of it, to be honest, because it seemed like she was channeling UKIP. There were various phrases there which I've used myself again and again. And I think her 12 priorities were all extremely sound, good priorities for a proper, clean, what some people have called hard Brexit. So yes, overwhelmingly welcome the speech.
Right, so we don't need UKIP anymore. There won't be any backsliding. You're pretty well signed up, you say, to everything she said. Therefore, there really isn't any need for UKIP, who Paul Nuttall, your leader, said would be there to stop her falling away from her promises.
Well, you know, I think what the PM set out today was, as I say, very sound principles. But let's not forget, it's not the PM who's got carte blanche to deliver Brexit on her own, and this is what UKIP is concerned about. She is surrounded by a very strong, very influential establishment. We're talking about the hardline Remainers, we're talking about the Supreme Court, we're talking about the House of Lords.
Yeah, but she dealt with those issues, didn't she?
Well, I don't think she did, in the sense that, of course, you know, what is she going to do if these people kick up a fuss? And there's no doubt that UKIP is still very strong on Brexit. We have to be strong on Brexit, and we have to make sure that we get the right Brexit.
Okay.
And it's still very much, I think, for us, a job of holding her feet to the fire. We've heard a lot of talk today, and I absolutely welcome the talk. It's the right kind of talk, but we still have to see the action. There's also, of course, what she was talking about, these transitional arrangements.
Right. Do you support the idea of a transitional arrangement, or is that for you still half in, half out?
Well, it depends what this transition looks like, doesn't it? And we look forward to seeing exactly what it does look like. For instance, something as fundamental a principle as the free movement of people, if that's a transitional scheme, we could potentially see higher levels of immigration from the European Union than we've ever seen before.
Right. What about being a member of certain programmes? Just to take you through some of the programmes, there were implications there that we could stay part of Europol. When she talked about security arrangements, that would mean we'd still be under the European Court of Justice when it comes to contractual arrangements. Would you support that?
No, absolutely not. That's completely unacceptable. And what I was very pleased to see was Theresa May, right at the outset of her speech, made it quite clear that Britain was not going to be subject to the power of any European court. So I think that was a fundamental
But we would be if we
principle
stayed part of Europol, wouldn't we?
Look, we've always said that, and I think Theresa May made it clear, that she wants to cooperate in terms of issues of security and defence with the European Union, but we are going to be out of the EU. So it's a fundamental principle, isn't it?
All right.
For me, I heard her say it's about free trade. If we cannot have free trade agreements and make our own free trade agreements, then that means we're going to be out of the customs union.
She did say, though, that the UK wouldn't sign up to full membership of the customs union. Would you consider that to still be half in, half out of the EU if we were signed up to certain sectors, certain industries, in order to remain part of the customs union for those in a way that Turkey is?
Well, again, it depends exactly what the negotiation looks like.
Right, but if we were still a bit in the customs union, would that not be good enough for you?
British businesses who want to export to the European Union are in any case going to have to meet all the EU requirements in order to export to that market. If our membership of the customs union, if that's the full extent of it, then frankly it's not going to make that much difference.
Right. I mean, in terms of contributions to the EU coffers, she ruled out making vast annual contributions to the EU. But what if there were some contributions, perhaps every other year? Would that be acceptable to you?
Again, let's see what that negotiated deal looks like. I think it is arguably fair and reasonable that while we are negotiating our way out, that we still contribute in some way. For me personally, and I think for UKIP, we'd say there should be an absolute cut-off point where we have absolutely zero contributions to the European Union. But again, you know, I think the direction of travel was a very hardline stance from May on our actually getting out of the EU, but also a conciliatory one as well. I was quite struck by how she did make some conciliatory noises to the European Union as well. And I think actually now the ball is in their court. We are being very reasonable from our perspective. It's now up to the EU to show some reasonable behaviour back.
Suzanne Evans from UKIP, thank you very much. Do you still think that we will be half in the EU if we don't fully come out of the customs union?
Well, as I said before, I think ultimately our destination is out of the customs union, because I suspect it'll come with too many strings attached for it to be reconcilable with a leave vote. But
even if it hits big industries like aerospace and car manufacturing, who do rely on an extensive supply chain within the EU customs union.
But there are many countries around the world who sell more to the EU without being in the customs union.
Yes, but how disruptive would it be if they had to prove rules of origin on every single component of a car or a plane?
This is what American producers manage to do, and they sell vast amounts of products in those industries to the European Union. The TIR system means that thousands of lorries are passing in and out of countries which have customs barriers without even slowing down. There are technological ways to ensure that the rules of origin system doesn't have to be a huge regulatory burden.
Right, and Norway and Switzerland, neither of whom are within the customs union, and they have, a multitude of free trade deals. They manage it.
Indeed, I think Norway and Switzerland are very different economies from the UK. And of course, if you look at the US automotive sector, contrary to what Theresa was saying, they don't sell vast amount of cars into the European Union. Most of the cars in the European Union are actually from within the European Union, created within the European Union. The country of origin rules are really critical here because our suppliers who feed into products, not just in the automotive sector, but products that are going from Europe to third countries outside, will begin to see them excluded from the supply chain within the next 9 months because it's an 18-month supply chain.
All right.
That's a serious problem for our business,
We'll come back
and the
to you.
Prime Minister mustn't take that seriously.
We'll come back to you in a moment, but let's get some more reaction, this time from the government. The Work and Pensions Secretary, Damien Green, who was at this morning's Cabinet meeting, joins me now from Lancaster House. Welcome to the Daily Politics. You were, of course, a Remainer before the referendum, now a member of the government. The Prime Minister said we're not going to be half in, half out. So can you clarify for us, is the UK going to leave fully the customs union?
Well, as she said, we're going to leave the single market. The customs union is more complex. We're going to leave the parts of it that stop us signing trade deals with other countries in the world. We've seen a lot of interest in free trade deals with Britain, and there are certain parts of the customs union that do that, but the Prime Minister made clear there are other parts of the customs union that we will be negotiating about, that we may wish to stay in. She's not got any preconceived notions of how best we do that, but certainly there are parts of the customs union that we won't want to stay in because we want to sign these free trade deals with other big economies around the world.
And because that's also an admission that otherwise key industries like aerospace and car manufacturing could be harmed in Britain if we came out totally of the customs union.
Well, she made the point that what we want to achieve is as near frictionless borders as we can. Clearly, there are, as you say, many big important industries, both in this country and in other countries around Europe, that depend on supply chains in different European countries. And obviously, we want as few customs barriers as we can in practical terms for those. And so that'll be obviously an important part of the negotiation, which illustrates actually that the best kind of deal is not just good for Britain, it's good for other European countries as well, because clearly that frictionless trade provides prosperity and jobs in all countries.
Now, and can you be clear in terms of contributions, financial contributions, that could continue to be made to the EU? It is clear from what she said that she's not ruling out altogether some financial contributions being made in order for us to have preferential access to the single market. Is that right?
It wasn't quite that. No, she said that we wouldn't make contributions in the traditional sense,
no,
but that there may well be individual projects that we'd want to get involved in,
like,
and that obviously, you know, we would look. Well, I mean, let's see what's on offer. I don't want to pick individual sectors or individual projects now, but in no circumstances it may be to Britain's advantage to make a financial contribution to specific projects.
Right, although that was a red line for certainly some of the Brexiteers before and after, in fact, the referendum. So on that basis, there could be some special contributions that are made in order to have some sort of advantages for certain sectors or industries. And she said that we might also want to remain part of some EU programmes. That's right too, is it?
Well, that's specifically what she was talking about when she said, she wasn't talking about sectors, she said that there may be specific programmes that it would be to Britain's advantage to be part of, and that's where it may be to our advantage to make contributions.
So in a way, we're not
programs.
Right. So we are still a bit in the EU in that case. If we're still making the odd contribution here or there, we're still part of perhaps some of the EU programmes, some of which could still be under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. We're half in, half out. We're not actually having this clean Brexit or hard Brexit that's been talked about.
No, I don't think that's true at all. I think the phrase she used a lot was that we will be in a strategic partnership with the EU, that Britain will be out of the EU, but we will obviously be friendly with neighbours, fellow democracies. So we want a strategic partnership. Now, as strategic partners, we may say, you know, here's a project, here's a programme that members of the EU and a non-member of the EU, like Britain, might want to join in. The EU does sign deals with countries that are not in the EU, so it's not unknown for that to happen. Britain will be outside the EU, but will be a friendly strategic partner of the EU and its member states.
Right. Damien Green, thank you very much for joining us there outside of Lancaster House. Just briefly, Theresa Villiers, when we look at the hard border, or the common, I should say, travel area between Ireland and Northern Ireland, she said that there wouldn't be a hard border. How can she guarantee that if we're coming out of the single market and almost all of the customs union?
We've had a common travel area for nearly 100 years, so
yes.
It predated EU membership. There's no reason why we can't continue it. Yes, there's a degree of risk of illegal migration by having an open and free-flowing border, but it's perfectly possible to manage that risk without border checkpoints. The reality is the key thing is how you cooperate with the immigration authorities on both sides of the border. For around 100 years, those immigration authorities have worked together to try and secure the external borders of the common travel area. That will continue. That's how we need to operate.
Let's leave that there because we can now talk to the Lib Dem leader, Tim Farron. Welcome to the Daily Politics. Looking lovely and sunny out there, if a little cold, no doubt, nice. By the Houses of Parliament. So, these are all your worst fears come true, Tim Farron. We're leaving the single market. We are leaving, if not totally, the customs union. It's the end of that kind of relationship with the EU.
Yeah, it seems to be the extreme version of Brexit that Theresa May was briefing in advance of this speech. And that is incredibly disappointing for anybody who thinks democracy matters, because what she has done is taken the views of 51.9% of the people who voted to leave the European Union last June and assume they all meant the same as Nigel Farage, and assume they wanted an extreme Brexit that was not on the ballot paper. So this is a theft of democracy as well as an attack on our economy. And to decide to do this without seeking the will and the opinion of the British people at the end of it is all the more offensive. What she did say, the only two really substantial things she said in the speech was, one, that she was going for the hard Brexit and ripping us out of the single market. The other was that Parliament would get a vote on the deal at the end of all this, which really is saying that politicians can have a bit of democracy at the end of this process, but the people can't.
Right, but you're elected.
We take the view that you start this process with democracy, as we did last June, but you do not end it with a stitch-up at some point in the near future.
Because you want to see a second referendum, although...
I want a first referendum on a deal we know nothing about yet.
Right.
All we know is that Theresa May has waved the white flag on the most important thing when it comes to our future relationship with Europe. Do we want to be in or out of the single market? Business is united in saying we should be in the single market. 90% of the electorate,
it's not united
if you
completely.
believe
That's not true to say they are 100%
I'm sure you
united.
could find somebody, but 90% of the people of all kinds in the most recent survey before Christmas say they want us to be in the single market. So to choose this extreme version is a theft of democracy.
All right, let's ask...
And the only way to close it is by asking people to say yes or no to the deal at the end of the process.
Right, well, let's ask what you can do about it, Tim Farron, as leader of the Liberal Democrats. Will you be instructing your peers to vote against triggering Article 50, which would start the negotiation process to try and block this happening?
So we've been very clear that we will use Parliament to amend whatever the government puts in front of us to ensure Britain gets the best deal, so that Britain does argue, for example, and fight its corner and business's corner to stay in the single market.
Right, so you will block it. You will block triggering Article 50, just to be clear.
No, well, I'll be very clear with you. Our red line is on a referendum. If the British people are not given their say at the end of all this, if the will of the people is ignored, if the people are cut out of this process, and this is a stitch-up between politicians and bureaucrats in Brussels and Whitehall, then we will not vote. We will vote against anything that cuts the people out of this process.
Right, so you want that second referendum. That is the red line.
We want a first referendum on the deal. Sorry to be pedantic.
Semantic.
It's not about a rerun, but it's important. We're going to get a deal. Yeah. We know nothing what it's going to look like. We have some idea of what Theresa May will and won't fight for. She won't fight for Britain's future in the European single market, which is bad for business, but we've got no clue really as to what it will look like at the end. Right. Why should the British people have that forced upon them when they've had no say?
Parliament is full of elected representatives like your good self. Why isn't that enough in terms of giving you the say on the final deal?
Well, if I'm honest with you, because we started with a referendum, I think that's how you've got to end up. We can't be in a situation where
to reverse the process that we will have been through.
If you think about it, if either the courts or even Parliament, elected though half of it is, were to, in inverted commas, frustrate the will of the people, that would be wrong and counterproductive.
All right.
The only way Britain is staying in the European Union, it would appear, even the single market now, is if the British people tell the government that is what they want. The Liberal Democrats are the only people providing the vehicle for that democracy to take place.
Right, you're representing, as you say, the 48% who voted
and I think probably a majority of the Leavers who want us to stay in the single market.
All right, well, obviously we don't know what the numbers are in terms of who wanted to stay in the single market.
We don't, but it's a lot more than none.
Right, well, I'm sure it is more than none. You may not like it, in fact I know you don't like it, but the issue of immigration was important one way or another. And do you not accept Theresa May is responding in some way to what many people felt was a need to take back some control of immigration and open borders?
I think what she's not doing, and what nobody else seems to be doing, is making the case for British people and our freedom of movement, British business, British students.
But answer the question
and
on
our
immigration.
Freedom of movement. So, but if you are concerned about immigration, it is a two-way street, and nobody seems to be arguing the best deal for us. And if you take Theresa May's line that freedom of movement is some kind of a red line, then don't accept what the other side say over membership of the single market. Go and argue Britain's case. If you want to be in the single market, and you don't want some of the other stuff that other people in Europe say we've got to have, don't just accept it.
All right.
Don't wave the white flag. Go and fight Britain's corner. She's waved the white flag and given up.
Tim Farron, thank you very much, Lib Dem leader there. Well, some had suggested in advance of today's speech that the Prime Minister might not tell us much. She hadn't already revealed about how the UK will approach the Brexit process. But as it turned out, she did make a number of significant and explicit statements, as we've already discussed. So let's have a look at some of the key things we have learned from the Prime Minister's speech. Firstly, Theresa May confirmed the final Brexit deal will be put to a vote in both Houses of Parliament. On the big subject of immigration, she said Brexit must mean control of the number of people who come to Britain from Europe, although she didn't give any further figures on that. She said the UK will pursue a bold free trade agreement with the EU, but she confirmed that, as expected, that will not mean membership of the single market. Also on trade, the Prime Minister wants to be able to strike deals with non-EU countries, so Britain will not retain full membership of the customs union. Instead, she wants some form of customs agreement with the EU. Theresa May also said the UK may continue to make payments to the EU after Brexit, but they won't be vast, whatever that means. And finally, on transition, she wants a phased process of implementation on any deal to avoid a disruptive cliff edge. Just finally, before the end of the programme, Theresa Villiers, your thoughts on what she said in regard to a warning to the EU if there were attempts to block a deal or make a bad deal that wasn't going to be advantageous to Britain, underlining Philip Hammond, the Chancellor's comments that actually Britain could take action to protect the economy. Was that wise to threaten when she had EU diplomats sat there in front of her?
Well, it was quite tough. It was a very sort of tough warning. I think it's only sort of setting out the facts in terms of the options that would be open to us as an independent country able to take our own decisions on
right,
this kind of matters.
And become, as Labour have called it, a bargain basement economy, making sure that corporation tax was even lower than is being proposed. Is that what you would see?
Well, we've set a direction of travel which in any event brings down corporation tax. I think what I doubt would be on the agenda would be sort of large-scale deregulation. I think we would certainly want to look at the body of EU regulation and see whether it's proportionate, whether we want to do things slightly differently, but in a number of areas I think we'd keep it. So I don't see that it would be a race to the bottom in terms of regulation.
Will you ally yourself with Tim Farron and the Liberal Democrats in terms of what he was saying?
No, I think what the Prime Minister said was that if the EU were not to give us a good deal, it would be an act of calamitous self-harm. Those were her words.
And you agree with that?
And she threatened 5 or 6 times. She used our intelligence services 5 or 6 times to back up that threat. You rightly pointed out that she has spoken of a deregulated tax haven backing up what Philip Hammond has already threatened. I believe that that threat, combined with this threat that maybe we would withdraw our cooperation on intelligence services, is a deeply damaging, huge moral mistake as well as a political one.
All right. Well, thank you very much to both of you for sitting here with me while Theresa May gave that critically important speech. That's all for today.
I've been getting away with it all my